August 1943. Block 28 of Auschwitz main camp. 17 women lie motionless on wooden bunks in the prisoner hospital ward, some burning with typhus fever, others barely conscious from dysentery, all trying not to cough, not to shift position, not to make a sound. 3 bunks away, a 22-year-old Polish political prisoner named Zofia watches the corridor through half-closed eyes. She's been awake for 6 hours, waiting. Because tonight, an SS doctor is conducting an unscheduled inspection of the hospital blocks, and any woman too sick to stand, any woman who looks like she might not recover fast enough to return to forced labor, will be marked for selection. Some will be sent to Block 10 for medical experiments. Others will receive a phenol injection directly into the heart. But Zofia isn't watching the corridor out of fear for herself. She's watching because in exactly 90 seconds, she's going to move 5 women from this room to another. And if she gets the timing wrong, if the flashlight beam catches them mid-transfer, if the count doesn't match the paperwork when the doctor reaches the next ward, every woman in this block will die tonight. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't luck. This was a system refined over months by prisoner nurses and doctors who learned to exploit a single vulnerability in the Nazi bureaucracy, a loophole that existed only at night, only during certain types of inspections, and only if you understood exactly how the SS conducted their counts and exactly when they looked at their lists. Today, survivors call it room switching or the shuffle. At the time, they didn't call it anything. They just did it, silently, methodically, risking immediate execution to buy sick women a few more days, maybe a week, maybe long enough to recover and avoid the experiments or the needle. The remarkable part isn't that it worked. The remarkable part is how often it worked, how many women survived, because prisoner medical staff understood something the SS didn't think mattered. That at night, in a system dependent on paperwork and room-by-room inspections, you could make patients disappear and reappear if you knew the pattern. What you need to understand before anything else is this. Most people think Auschwitz selections were random, chaotic, unpredictable moments when an SS doctor pointed left or right on a whim. That's partly true for arrivals on the ramp. But inside the camp, especially in the hospital blocks, selections followed procedures. They had patterns. They happened on schedules. And those patterns created a window, narrow and dangerous, but repeatable, where prisoner staff could move sick women out of sight just long enough to survive the count. The trick wasn't hiding women for days. It was moving them through a selection in progress, using the SS's own inspection routine against them. By the time the doctor realized a room had fewer patients than the paperwork indicated, he'd already moved to the next block, and reversing course would mean admitting his count was wrong, which would mean admitting he'd lost control of the process. So here's what I'm going to show you, how the hospital block selection system actually functioned, step by step. Why nights created specific opportunities that daytime inspections didn't allow, what prisoner medical staff had to know about timing, about paperwork, about guard rotations, about which SS doctors were meticulous and which ones were lazy, how they executed the room switch, who could be moved and who couldn't, what happened when it went wrong. And then I'll walk you through one specific night in August 1943, when the entire system nearly collapsed because an SS doctor did something he'd never done before. He went back. Because this isn't a story about one heroic moment. It's about incremental resistance inside a system designed to make resistance impossible. It's about prisoner nurses who memorized inspection patterns the way you'd memorize an enemy's patrol route. It's about understanding that under certain totalitarian bureaucracies, the paperwork matters more than the people. And if you can manipulate the paperwork, even for 30 minutes, you can save lives. But it's also about the cost. The women who got moved had a chance. The women who were too sick to be moved, who couldn't stand or walk quietly or suppress a coughing fit, they stayed. And they died. Someone had to choose who got moved and who didn't. Prisoner doctors and nurses made those choices every time a selection was announced. If you're interested in untold Holocaust survival tactics and how prisoners resisted within systems designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance, in the moral complexity of life and death, decisions made by people with no good options, hit that subscribe button. This channel focuses on the mechanisms of atrocity and resistance, the documented details. Most documentaries skip. And I can only keep researching these stories if I know they're reaching people who want to understand history at this level of depth. As we go through this, I want you to think about a question and drop your answer in the comments. If you were a prisoner nurse and could only move 3 women out of a room with 7 women too sick to pass selection, how would you choose? Age. Likelihood of recovery? Who had family in the camp? I'll come back to this question at the end, but start thinking about it now, because the prisoner medical staff at Auschwitz had to answer it repeatedly. Let's rewind to March 1942, because understanding the tactic requires understanding the hospital block system and why the SS conducted selections there in the first place. When women prisoners first arrived at Auschwitz, initially in the main camp, later in Birkenau, The camp hospital, called the Riviere or Krankenbau, wasn't designed to heal anyone. Its purpose was to isolate prisoners too sick to work, document their decline, and remove them from the camp population when they became, in Nazi terminology, unproductive burdens. The Riviere had blocks for infectious disease, for surgery, for recovery. Prisoner doctors and nurses, often medical professionals before deportation, ran day-to-day operations under SS supervision. They had almost no medications, insufficient bandages, no proper surgical equipment, but they had something the SS needed: medical knowledge and the ability to maintain records that made the extermination process look organized and defensible. Here's the key detail that shaped everything. The Riviere operated on documentation. Every patient had a card with their prisoner number, diagnosis, admission date, and assigned block and bunk. And when SS doctors conducted selections, they didn't examine every patient individually. They walked through wards with a prisoner clerk who held the patient list. The doctor would glance at patients, ask a few questions. Can you work? When did the fever start? How long have you been here? And then mark names on the list. A check mark meant you stayed. A cross meant selection. Either immediate death by phenol injection or transfer to experimental blocks. This documentation dependency created the system's vulnerability. Because the SS relied on lists, not memory. They didn't know patients by face or name. They knew them by number and location. Room 3, bunk 12, prisoner 27483. If the paperwork said that prisoner was in room 3, and the doctor saw someone in bunk 12 when he entered room 3, he marked the list and moved on. The assumption was that prisoners were too terrified, too weak, too surveilled to manipulate the system. And during daytime selections, that assumption held. Daylight meant visibility, guards at every door, SS personnel moving freely through blocks. Prisoner movement was tracked constantly. Attempting to switch rooms during a day selection would be spotted immediately. And the punishment would be public execution for everyone involved. But night selections operated differently. They happened after evening roll call, but usually between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., when most of the camp was locked down. The SS doctor conducting the selection would arrive with 1 or 2 guards and a prisoner clerk carrying the room-by-room patient lists. They'd move systematically through the hospital block, room by room, inspecting patients by flashlight or dim overhead bulbs. This created a temporal gap. The doctor couldn't be in 2 rooms simultaneously. While he was inspecting room 1, rooms 2 through 8 hadn't been inspected yet. And here's the critical part. The lists were organized by room, not by individual patient. The doctor would enter room 1, count patients, compare the count to the list, examine those who looked sickest, mark selections, then move to room 2. He didn't carry a master list of every patient in the block cross-referenced by face. He carried a room inventory. Prisoner medical staff figured out that if you could move patients between rooms after the doctor had finished one room but before he reached the next, you could effectively make sick women disappear from the selection. The doctor inspects room 1, marks 3 women for selection, moves to room 2. While he's in room 2, you quietly move 2 sick women from room 3, which he hasn't reached yet, back into room 1, which he's already cleared. You adjust the paperwork to show those 2 women were always in room 1. When the doctor reaches room 3, the count matches the list because you've removed 2 patients. If he notices anything, you claim administrative error, that they were mistakenly listed in the wrong room. The doctor, not wanting to admit confusion or restart the entire inspection, accepts the correction and continues. This required extraordinary precision, timing, silence, and a prisoner clerk willing to falsify records in real time while standing 3 feet from an SS guard. The clerk was crucial because she held the lists. She had to track which women were moved, update the room counts before the doctor noticed discrepancies, and provide explanations that sounded bureaucratic, not conspiratorial. Many of these clerks were educated women, often doctors or nurses themselves, who'd memorized hundreds of prisoner numbers and could manipulate the paperwork without hesitation. They also had to identify which SS doctors could be fooled and which couldn't. Some SS physicians were meticulous, recounting patients multiple times, cross-checking numbers obsessively. Those doctors couldn't be deceived, but others were careless, lazy, or drunk. They trusted the paperwork, wanted the selection finished quickly, and didn't scrutinize discrepancies as long as the count was close. So prisoner medical staff developed profiles. They knew Dr. Edward Wirtz, who since conducted selections with clinical precision and couldn't be manipulated. They knew Dr. Fritz Klein was often drunk during night inspections and rarely recounted. They knew certain guards could be distracted with procedural questions while patients were moved. This intelligence was gathered over months, shared quietly between prisoner doctors and nurses, and refined through trial and error. Every successful room switch provided data. Every failed attempt, and there were failures, resulting in immediate executions, clarified the risks. But understanding the mechanism doesn't convey what it felt like to execute. Imagine you're a prisoner nurse. You've just learned an SS doctor will conduct a selection tonight in your block. You have maybe 90 minutes to prepare. First, you assess which women are most at risk, high fever, visible weakness, chronic illness, anyone who's been in the Revere more than 2 weeks. You identify maybe 8 women in rooms 3 and 4 who will certainly be selected if the doctor sees them. Next, you determine how many can be moved. Can they walk silently? Can they suppress coughing? Can they follow whispered instructions in darkness? Maybe 5 can be moved, 3 cannot. You've just decided who lives and who dies, and you have no time to reconsider because you need to coordinate with the clerk, identify which rooms the doctor will inspect first, and position women near doorways so they can move quickly when the signal comes. Now it's 1:00 a.m. The doctor arrives. You hear boots in the corridor. Flashlight beams sweep through the first room. You're in room 3 with 5 women who need to be moved. You can hear the doctor questioning patients 2 rooms away. You estimate you have 4 minutes before he finishes room 2 and moves toward you. The women are standing now, barefoot, silent, watching you for the signal. One is shaking with fever, but insists she can walk. Another is barely conscious, but 2 prisoners are supporting her. You wait. The doctor's voice gets louder. He's finishing room 2. You hear him step into the corridor. You have 30 seconds. You give the signal. 5 women move through the doorway, turning left toward room 1, which the doctor has already cleared. They move in darkness. No talking, no sound except bare feet on concrete. You watch them disappear into room 1. 15 seconds. 20. You hear the doctor's boots approaching room 3. The women aren't back yet to confirm they made it. The doctor enters your room. You stand at attention. He sweeps his flashlight across the bunks, counting. The clerk reads the list. Room 3, 11 patients. The doctor counts again. 11. It matches. He begins examining the sickest women, the ones who couldn't be moved. You stand there knowing you've just saved 5 lives, and you're watching him mark 3 others for death. Women you chose not to move because they were too sick or too loud or because you simply ran out of time. That's the psychological weight prisoner medical staff carried. Every room switch was a triage decision with no right answers, and the SS never knew it was happening because the paperwork matched, the counts were correct, and the women who were selected gave the system enough victims to satisfy the quota. The tactic had variations depending on circumstances. Sometimes women were moved forward to already inspected rooms, as I just described. Other times, they were moved backward to rooms the doctor hadn't reached yet, then moved again after he passed through, a double shuffle that required perfect timing and multiple conspirators. Occasionally, women were hidden in storage areas, latrines, or administrative offices for the duration of the selection, then returned to their bunks afterward. That approach was riskier because it required moving women out of the block entirely, past guards, through corridors that might be patrolled. But it was used when the selection was particularly aggressive or when the doctor was known to recount rooms. There were rules, unwritten but absolute. Never move more than 30% of at-risk patients in a single selection, because removing too many would make the count discrepancy obvious. Never move the same woman twice in consecutive selections, because patterns could be noticed. Never attempt the tactic if the SS doctor was accompanied by more than 2 guards, because additional personnel meant more eyes watching. And never, under any circumstances, move a woman who might cry out, collapse, or draw attention. The entire operation depended on silence and invisibility. One mistake would expose the system and result in mass executions. Success rates are impossible to quantify because documentation didn't survive, and survivors' accounts vary. But testimony from multiple prisoner doctors suggests that in blocks where the tactic was used, somewhere between 20 and 40% of women targeted for selection in night inspections were successfully hidden or shuffled. That doesn't sound like much. But over the course of months, across multiple blocks, it meant hundreds of women avoided immediate death and gained time to recover. Some survived the war because of those extra days. Others were eventually selected in later inspections or succumbed to their illnesses. But the tactic gave them a chance. And in Auschwitz, a chance was everything. The limits were brutal and non-negotiable. Women too sick to move couldn't be saved. Women whose names had already been recorded in selection lists before the inspection started couldn't be hidden because the SS would search for them specifically. Women in isolation wards for highly contagious diseases couldn't be moved because transferring them would spread infection and kill other prisoners. And women selected during daytime inspections had no options at all, because daytime offered no cover, no timing gaps, no procedural confusion to exploit. The tactic worked exclusively at night, exclusively during certain types of inspections, exclusively when the conditions aligned. Prisoner staff had to recognize those conditions instantly and execute without hesitation, knowing that failure meant not just the death of the women they were trying to save, but their own deaths and the deaths of everyone who helped. Now let me take you inside one specific night, August 17th, 1943, Block 28 of the Auschwitz main camp Revier, because this is the night when the system nearly collapsed, and when prisoner medical staff learned exactly how fragile their resistance actually was. The details come from post-war testimony by Margita Svalbova, a Slovak Jewish prisoner who worked as a clerk in the hospital blocks, and from corroborating accounts by several survivors who were patients that night. The selection was announced at evening roll call. SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Friedrich Entress would conduct a hospital inspection beginning at midnight. Entress was known to prisoner staff as moderately careless, someone who could be fooled if the deception was executed cleanly. Not the easiest target, but not impossible. Block 28 had 73 women that night, distributed across 8 rooms. Svalbova and the senior prisoner nurse, a Polish political prisoner whose name wasn't recorded in testimony, assessed the situation. They identified 12 women who would almost certainly be selected if Entress saw them. 7 could potentially be moved. 5 could not, either because they were too sick, too delirious, or too weak to walk. The plan was straightforward. Entress would begin in room 1 and proceed sequentially. While he inspected rooms 1 and 2, the 7 at-risk women from rooms 4 and 5 would be moved back into rooms 1 and 2 after he cleared them. The paperwork would be adjusted to show administrative reassignments earlier that day. The women would stay hidden in the already inspected rooms until Entress finished the entire block and left. Then they'd be returned to their original locations. Simple, repeatable, low risk if executed correctly. Midnight. Entress arrived with 2 guards and entered room 1. Svalbova stood beside him, holding the patient list, reading names and numbers as he examined women by flashlight. He marked 4 selections in room 1, moved to room 2, marked 3 more. 15 minutes elapsed. He stepped into the corridor between rooms 2 and 3. This was the window. Svalbova gave a barely perceptible nod to the nurse waiting in the corridor. The 7 women began moving from rooms 4 and 5, walking silently back toward rooms 1 and 2. They moved in darkness, barefoot, some supporting each other. Entress was facing away from them, speaking to one of the guards. 10 seconds. 15. The women reached rooms 1 and 2, slipped inside, and disappeared into bunks vacated by women who had already been selected and removed. 20 seconds total. Clean execution. No sound. No detection. Entress continued. Room 3, Room 4, Room 5. In rooms 4 and 5, the counts matched the adjusted paperwork. Svalbova had altered the lists to show the 7 women as transferred earlier that day. Entress noticed nothing. He marked additional selections in rooms 6 and 7, routine choices, women who were genuinely too sick to survive much longer. By 12:40 a.m., he'd finished room 8. The selection was complete. 14 women marked for phenol injections. The 7 hidden women had survived. Entress turned to leave, and then he stopped. He turned back to Svalbova and said something that made her blood freeze. Room 2. How many typhus cases? Svalbova didn't hesitate, couldn't hesitate. 3. Herr Hauptsturmführer. Entress paused. The list showed 5 this morning. Svalbova's mind raced. The list had shown 5 because 2 of the hidden women were typhus patients moved from room 4. She needed an explanation that sounded bureaucratic, routine, not suspicious. 2 were transferred to Block 29 isolation ward this afternoon. Herr Hauptsturmführer. Standard quarantine protocol. Entress stared at her. 5 seconds of silence. 10. Was he buying it? Was he about to demand a recount? Was he about to walk back to room 2 and discover 7 women who shouldn't be there? Entress nodded once. Fine, record the transfers properly. He turned and walked out. The guards followed. The block door closed. Svalbova stood motionless for 30 seconds, waiting for the sound of boots to fade completely down the corridor. When silence returned, she exhaled. The 7 women had survived. But the system had nearly broken because of one offhand question, one minor discrepancy that Entress almost pursued. If he demanded to see the transfer documentation, which didn't exist, the deception would have collapsed instantly. If he'd walked back to room 2 to recount, he would have found women who weren't supposed to be there. Mass execution would have followed, not just for the 7 hidden women, but for Svalbova, for the nurse who gave the signal, for anyone the SS suspected of conspiracy. That night taught prisoner medical staff a crucial lesson. The tactic worked only when everything aligned perfectly. Documentation had to be airtight. Explanations had to be instant and credible. And you needed luck, the kind of luck where an SS doctor accepts your answer instead of investigating further. The margin for error was non-existent. One inconsistent detail, one suspicious pause, one woman coughing at the wrong moment, and the entire operation would be exposed. The 7 women who survived that night were returned to their original rooms after Entress left. 5 of them recovered enough to be released from the Revier within 2 weeks. 2 remained hospitalized longer. One of those 2, a Hungarian Jewish woman whose name wasn't preserved in testimony, survived until January 1945 and was evacuated during the death marches. She survived the war. The other died in October 1943 during a subsequent selection that couldn't be manipulated. Of the 14 women Entress selected that night, all were dead within 48 hours, killed by phenol injection administered by SS orderlies. Those are the stakes we're talking about. Room switching wasn't a guaranteed survival method. It was a desperate tactic that sometimes bought sick women enough time to recover and sometimes didn't. It depended on courage, precision, and circumstances beyond anyone's control. But prisoner medical staff used it repeatedly because doing nothing meant certain death for every woman too sick to pass selection. Attempting the tactic meant some women might survive. That calculation, that choice to act despite the risks, is what made it resistance. Let me be clear about what this wasn't. It wasn't a secret the entire camp knew. It wasn't taught or formalized. It wasn't discussed openly. Most prisoners, even those in hospital blocks, never knew it was happening. The tactic was executed by a small group of prisoner doctors, nurses, and clerks who had access to patient lists, who understood the inspection procedures, and who were willing to risk execution. They didn't tell patients what they were doing because patients couldn't be trusted not to react, not to make noise, not to accidentally reveal the system under interrogation. The women being moved often didn't understand why they were being shuffled between rooms in darkness. They were simply told to move, to stay quiet, and to trust that someone was trying to keep them alive. This creates a moral complexity that can't be ignored. The prisoner staff who executed room switching had to choose which women to save and which to leave behind. Those choices were made based on medical assessments: who was most likely to recover, who could move silently, who had the best chance of surviving if given more time. But pragmatic triage doesn't erase the emotional and ethical weight of deciding that one woman gets hidden while another, equally deserving of life, stays and dies because there wasn't enough time to move everyone. Survivor testimony from prisoner medical staff describes this burden as unbearable. They saved lives. They also chose who wouldn't be saved. Both things are true simultaneously. And here's what makes it even more complicated. The tactic only worked because the SS system was bureaucratic and dependent on documentation. That same bureaucracy was what enabled the Holocaust's industrial scale. The Nazis didn't murder millions through chaos. They murdered millions through organization, through lists and paperwork and procedures that made mass killing manageable and routine. Prisoner medical staff exploited that bureaucracy's weaknesses, but they were also trapped within it. They could manipulate room counts and patient lists, but they couldn't stop the selections from happening. They couldn't prevent the experiments in Block 10. They couldn't shut down the gas chambers. They could only save a few women at a time, temporarily, by working within the very system designed to kill everyone. That's the lesson that extends beyond Auschwitz, beyond the Holocaust, into how we understand resistance under totalitarian systems. Resistance doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like clerks falsifying paperwork. Sometimes it looks like nurses moving patients between rooms in darkness. Sometimes it looks like small incremental acts of defiance that save a handful of lives while the machinery of murder continues operating around them. Those acts don't stop the atrocity. They don't fundamentally challenge the system, but they matter because they represent a refusal to accept that every life targeted by the system is already lost. They matter because prisoner staff chose to act when they could have chosen complicity or passivity. But we also have to acknowledge what was lost. The 5 women in Block 28 who couldn't be moved on August 17, 1943. The thousands of women in other blocks where prisoner staff didn't have access to patient lists, or didn't understand the inspection patterns, or didn't have the courage to attempt the tactic. The women who were moved successfully in one selection but died in the next because their illness was too severe, or because the next SS doctor was more meticulous. Room switching didn't save everyone. It didn't even save most people. It saved some under specific conditions when everything went right. So when you hear this story, don't let it become a feel-good narrative about ingenuity triumphing over evil. The evil triumphed. The vast majority of women selected for experiments or execution died. The system functioned exactly as designed. What prisoner medical staff accomplished was creating small cracks in that system, moments where a few women slipped through and survived. Those cracks mattered desperately to the women who survived because of them, but they didn't break the machine. The aftermath isn't something you measure in statistics. It's measured in the prisoner doctors who survived the war and spent decades haunted by the women they didn't move, the women they chose to leave behind because there wasn't time or because they were too sick or because moving them would have exposed the entire operation. Margita Svalbova, the clerk from Block 28, gave testimony in 1961 during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. She described the room switching tactic in clinical detail, explaining the procedures, the timing, the risks. But when asked how she decided which women to move, she couldn't answer. The transcript records a long silence, then a simple statement. "I don't know how we made those choices. I just know we had to make them." That's the moral injury that doesn't heal. Not guilt over wrongdoing, but the psychological wound of being forced into impossible choices by a system designed to make you complicit in its logic. Prisoner medical staff didn't create the selections. They didn't design the experiments. They didn't run the gas chambers. But they had to participate in triage. in deciding who had the best chance of survival, in categorizing human beings by their usefulness to a resistance tactic. The Nazis created the conditions where saving one life meant abandoning another. Prisoner staff had to live with the consequences of that forced choice for the rest of their lives. And here's the part that connects this to broader questions about how systems of dehumanization function. The room-switching tactic worked because the SS didn't see prisoners as individuals. They saw them as numbers on lists, as administrative problems to be processed. That dehumanization was the engine of genocide, the mechanism that allowed ordinary people to participate in mass murder without confronting the humanity of their victims. But it was also the system's vulnerability, because if prisoners were just numbers, then manipulating the numbers could manipulate the system. The same bureaucratic thinking that enabled industrial-scale killing created gaps where resistance was possible. This is why studying these tactics matters. Not because they were effective at stopping the Holocaust, they weren't, but because they reveal how totalitarian systems operate and where their weaknesses lie. Authoritarian bureaucracies depend on documentation, on procedures, on the assumption that everyone will follow the rules because deviation is too dangerous. When people inside the system understand it well enough to exploit its dependencies, when they're willing to take risks that the system assumes no one will take, small acts of resistance become possible. Those acts don't overthrow the system, but they create space for survival within it. The prisoner medical staff at Auschwitz understood something crucial. They understood that the SS valued procedural order more than individual accuracy. An SS doctor would rather accept a clerk's explanation for a discrepancy than admit he'd lost control of a selection. The paperwork had to be correct, even if the reality underneath the paperwork was manipulated, because acknowledging manipulation would mean acknowledging that prisoners had agency, had intelligence, had the capacity to deceive their captors. The Nazi worldview couldn't tolerate that acknowledgement. So the SS accepted the paperwork, and women survived. But let's also talk about who couldn't be saved through this tactic, because those limitations define the system's brutality just as much as the successes define resistance. Women selected during arrival at the camp, on the ramp, where SS doctors made instant decisions about life or death with no paperwork, no room assignments, no bureaucratic process to exploit, those women had no chance. Women who were already registered for experiments by name, where Dr. Mengele or other SS physicians had specifically requested them for research. Those women couldn't be hidden because the SS would search for them individually. Women whose illnesses were visible, who had visible disabilities, who couldn't walk or couldn't control their symptoms. Moving them would draw attention and expose the tactic. Women in blocks where the prisoner medical staff were complicit with the SS or too terrified to attempt resistance. In those blocks, every selection proceeded exactly as the Nazis intended. The tactic's scope was limited, its success rate was partial, and its existence depended on a small number of people willing to risk everything. It wasn't a solution. It was a temporary, dangerous intervention that saved some women some of the time. Framing it as anything more than that dishonors the women who died despite everything prisoner staff tried to do. So what do we take from this? What does room switching teach us about resistance, about survival, about the choices people make when every option is terrible? First, resistance under totalitarian systems doesn't look like what we imagine. It's not dramatic sabotage or armed uprising. It's clerks falsifying paperwork at midnight. It's nurses memorizing guard rotations. It's doctors making split-second triage decisions that will haunt them forever. It's small, it's incremental, and it saves far fewer people than we'd like to believe. But it's still resistance because it represents a refusal to let the system operate without friction, a determination to save whoever can be saved even when saving everyone is impossible. Second, understanding these tactics requires us to sit with moral complexity. The prisoner staff who executed room switching weren't heroes in the simple sense. They were people forced into impossible situations who chose to act rather than do nothing. They saved lives. They also made choices about who wouldn't be saved. Both realities coexist. Honoring their courage means acknowledging the burden they carried, the trauma of being forced to participate in triage inside a death camp. Third, bureaucratic systems create vulnerabilities that can be exploited, but only by people who understand the system intimately and are willing to take enormous risks. The SS designed the selection process to be efficient, orderly, and difficult to disrupt. Prisoner staff found the single point of vulnerability, nighttime inspections with sequential room checks, and built a tactic around it. But that tactic required detailed knowledge, perfect timing, and the willingness to risk immediate execution. Most prisoners didn't have access to that knowledge. Most people in that situation wouldn't have taken that risk. The fact that anyone did reveals something profound about human capacity for resistance, even under conditions designed to eliminate it. Finally, and this is the part that's hardest to articulate, these stories matter because they restore agency to people the Nazis tried to reduce to passive victims. The Holocaust was designed to strip agency from its targets, to make survival random and death inevitable. Tactics like room switching, even with their limited scope and partial success, prove that prisoners found ways to act, to choose, to resist within a system that tried to make resistance impossible. That doesn't redeem the Holocaust. Nothing redeems it. But it complicates our understanding of survival, showing that even in the most extreme conditions, people found ways to fight for life. The women who survived because they were moved between rooms during a selection carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Some never learned why they were moved, why they were told to walk silently from one room to another in darkness. Others understood what was happening and spent decades wondering why they were chosen to live while others weren't. And the prisoner medical staff who made those choices, who executed the tactic night after night until liberation or until they themselves were killed, carried a different burden, the weight of deciding who gets a chance and who doesn't. The knowledge that your resistance saved some people and couldn't save others. There's no resolution to that weight, no way to balance the moral equation. Just the reality that in systems designed for mass murder, small acts of resistance matter desperately to the people they save, even as they fail to stop the larger machinery of death. So here's my question for you, and I want you to think carefully before answering in the comments. If you were a prisoner nurse with access to patient lists and the knowledge to execute room switching, but you could only move a limited number of women during each selection, how would you make that choice? Would you prioritize women most likely to recover? Women with family in the camp? The youngest? Would you rotate who gets moved to spread the chance? Or would the moral weight of choosing be too much, and you'd refuse to participate in a system that forces you to decide who lives and who dies? There's no right answer, but the prisoner medical staff at Auschwitz had to answer it repeatedly, and their answers saved lives. I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know how you think about this impossible choice. If this kind of deep historical analysis matters to you, if you want to understand the documented mechanics of resistance inside the Holocaust rather than simplified narratives, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel exists to explore the details most documentaries skip, the moral complexity most summaries erase, and the documented human choices that shaped survival and death in the camps. And hit that like button if you think this story needs to be told, because these tactics, these choices, these small acts of resistance deserve to be remembered as carefully as we remember the atrocities they tried to resist. The room switching tactic didn't stop the Holocaust, but it meant that some women, on some nights, survived selections they were supposed to die in. And in Auschwitz, that was everything. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, did you know prisoner medical staff could manipulate SS inspections like this? What other untold resistance tactics do you want me to cover next? Room switching didn't save everyone, just some, and that was everything. I'll see you in the next one.